Today we feel very fortunate to celebrate the anniversary of José Martí's birth with foremost Martí scholar Anne Fountain, Professor Emerita of San Jose State University. Her books about Martí include José Martí and U.S. Writers, Versos Sencillos, a dual language edition, José Martí, the United States and Race, and Ramona Novela Americana, a critical edition of Martí's 1888 translation of the Helen Hunt Jackson novel of 1884. She has lectured and published extensively about Martí and Cuban topics and is currently working on a book called Teaching Nuestra América. Her lecture today will present examples of prose translations that range from excellent to problematic. It is the first of several lectures on Martí we will be presenting this year, with the hope of generating interest in his writings among English-speaking readers and guiding them to choose the best translations of Martí's oeuvre. Please join me in welcoming Anne Fountain.
Martí in translation: the good, the bad, and the very unusual. What is the purpose of translation? For many, it lets a reader understand what is written in a language the reader does not know. What, then, is the translator's task? In a 2008 article in Translation Review, Claire Sullivan writes of translators: "We bear a heavy responsibility, that of absorbing the full intent of an author and rendering that intent as faithfully and authentically as possible in another language." What this talk will cover: a quick look at the first person to translate Martí into English, an overview of Martí's prose works in English translation, a focus on translation of a famous essay, a look at what can go wrong, examples of problematic translations. But who was the first person to translate and publish portions of Martí's work? Her name was Cecil Charles, real name Lily Curry Tyner, and she translated some of Martí's poems in a book printed in New York in 1898. The poems by Cecil Charles lack appeal for a modern reader and carry a very definitive 19th century air. You can access this work for yourself and read it at the Digital Archive of the Library of Congress. Please go and see the translations for yourself. Today, a vast number of publications, from literary anthologies to mass market items, include Martí's poetry in English and English language internet versions of his most popular verses flourish. In this talk, however, the spotlight is on translations of Martí's prose, and we'll give examples from collections meant for a popular audience and selections from academic writing. First, let's look at published collections of Martí's writing and the translators who made them possible. In 1953, the centenary of Martí's birth, Juan de Onís, son of Federico de Onís, a distinguished professor of Hispanic letters at Columbia University, and Harriet de Onís, a prolific and influential translator of Latin American literature, published Selected Writings of José Martí, The America of José Martí. This book proved an excellent introduction to Martí in English and captured much of the Cuban author's style. In 1966, Luis Baralt, a professor equally at home in English and Spanish, who taught at universities in both Cuba and the United States, and whose parents knew Martí in New York, engaged in a true labor of love to faithfully convey Martí's writing about the United States. Baralt's book, Martí on the USA, acknowledged the work of Juan de Onís and indicated that the two translations only coincided in the case of a very few essays, and that in those cases the versions were different. Both de Onís and Baralt translated Martí's essay about Walt Whitman, but Baralt's version included 56 endnotes, many of which cited the sources for quotations from Whitman. Both de Onís and Baralt abridged some translations, so in a few instances, a piece is not translated in its entirety. In the 1970s and 80s, introductions to Martí's work in English expanded. In a review essay published in a Latin American Studies journal in December of 1990, I reported on six works on Martí, on which Philip Foner and Eleanor Randall collaborated as editor and translator, respectively. In the review essay, I noted translation inconsistencies along with the flawed editing and the editor's reliance on plagiarism. But now I have much more to say about the translations, which have many problematic aspects. I'll come back to the translation issue later. My complete review is available at the link listed on the slide. In 2002, Esther Allen gave readers in English access to a comprehensive survey of Martí's work, including poetry, notebooks, and correspondence, and a generous selection of chronicles and essays. Allen's José Martí Selected Writings, a Penguin Classics book widely available, is a highly successful example of Claire Sullivan's suggestion that a translator should render an author's intent, quote, as faithfully and authentically as possible. For some Martí works, numerous versions exist in English. Martí's 1882 profile of Emerson has translations by de Onís, Baralt, and Allen, and his essay on Walt Whitman has at least 5 versions in English. The landmark essay of 1891, Nuestra América, Our America, now taught in English in many courses in the United States, including those in American Studies, U.S. Literature, U.S. History, Latin American Studies, and Chicanx Latinx classes, is featured in most new anthologies of U.S. literature and appears in at least 8 distinct translations. Nuestra América translators include Esther Allen, Juan de Onís, abridged, John J. Hassett, Enrique Sacerio Garí, John D. Blanco, Eleanor Randall, Alfred J. Lopez, and Harper Montgomery, abridged. That translation is in the large book pictured on the right of the slide. The image on the left shows some of the books in which a translation of Nuestra América appears. What makes a translation good, bad, or highly unusual? Translating Martí's exuberant prose with its cascading sentences and many allusions is a challenge for the best translators. In the hands of those who have rushed to meet a deadline or simply lack the language expertise to faithfully convey the text message, the results can be curious, preposterous, erroneous, or even completely contrary to what Martí wrote. What can go wrong? Tight deadlines, lack of language expertise, deliberate omissions or additions, assertion of a literary or political agenda, failure to consider the context, some or all of the above. Alfred J. Lopez, in Lost in Translation, José Martí and the New American Studies, shows how even a book with the word translation in its title can go astray. Lopez gives examples from Translating Empire, José Martí, Migrant Latino Subjects, and American Modernities by Laura Lomas. In Lost in Translation, Lopez shows how a misunderstanding of Spanish passive voice in construction in the phrase se le respira, it is breathed, one breathes it, they breathe it, caused confusion for the author-translator and was part of a broader misreading. In Translating Empire, Lomas gives in English a salient line from Martí's article about Aboriginal authors published in 1884. Martí suggested that the spirit of indigenous authors floated above the land where they had lived. I quote, "El espíritu de los hombres flota sobre la tierra en que vivieron, y se le respira." The version in English became, "The spirit of men floats on the land in which they lived, and that breathes them still. But the land is not doing the breathing. The people are breathing the air of their ancestors." In another example, Lopez details how, in a commentary on Walt Whitman and Martí, Lomas used subterfuge, quote, "in stringing together several short phrases out of order and from different parts of the essay to fabricate an entirely different meaning that exists neither in Martí's essay nor Whitman's poem. In this case, the translator confused the pronoun el, an accent, he, with el, the, with resulting distortion." Lopez concludes, "As with the mistranslated phrase se le respira in chapter 1, here too a small translating error derails the reading of a key paragraph." This is a brief summary of the problems Lopez identified, but his analyses are discerning. Translating Empire's treatment of Martí and Emerson also relies on questionable translations, a topic detailed in my chapter, Martí and Emerson, Close Reading Context and Translation, in Sinking the Americas, a book pictured on the next slide. Several miscues in rendering Spanish to English appear in the Lomas chapter in Sinking the Americas. When referencing Martí's opinion about the role of the critic, Lomas offered a version in English of this line, I quote, "Criticar no es morder, ni tenacear, ni clavar en la áspera picota." In this sentence, Martí had succinctly listed harsh punishments that a critic should not apply. To criticize is not to bite, tear the flesh, or pillory. But Lomas's odd English version veered from the directness of the original and suggests that she did not understand the meaning of picota, a word which also appears in Martí's extensively translated essay, Nuestra América. Lomas wrote, I quote, To criticize is not to bite, not to forcibly grab the nose with pliers, nor to drive a nail into an unformed rough rock. In the same chapter, on pages 154 and 155, Loma cited a passage from Martí about workers in the United States, but misquoted several parts, which in turn affected the translation. Several pages later, she translated the word palpitar, to throb, as palpate, meaning to touch, examine by touch. Thus, quote, oigo vibrar y palpitar las fábricas inmensas became, I hear vibrate and palpate the immense factories. Some Laura Lomas translations leave readers with peculiar imagery. An article for Translation Review, Thinking Across Infiltration and Transculturation, José Martí's Theory and Practice of Post-Colonial Translation in New York, includes a one-line description of a Black man burned to death in 1892. Martí's article stated, I quote, en Arkansas se unieron tejanos y arkanseños y mujeres y hombres y quemaron contra un pino un negro untado de petróleo. Lomas rendered the line with a descriptor of those from Arkansas as Arkansinos, and hinted at a punishment of tarring and feathering, which minimized the horror of the scene. Her translation, I quote, read, in Arkansas, Texans and Arkansinos, women and men, came together and burned at the stake of a tree a Black man covered with tar. In fact, as Martí's article makes clear, the Black man was tied to a tree, not a stake, and drenched in petroleum, not covered with tar. A crowd of 5,000 watched as the woman who had accused the man of rape lit a match and set him ablaze. The single line in translation, with odd wording and without context, minimized the nature of the disturbing scene and the lynching of Blacks as public spectacle, something that peaked in the United States in 1892, the year of Martí's chronicle. The same article in Translation Review includes another case of odd wording based on a misquoted text. In an August 1886 letter to his Mexican friend Manuel Mercado, Martí expressed anguish over a crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border and the threat of war. He stressed minimizing potential conflicts and the importance of lessons learned. In the following lines, Martí told what was needed. I quote, la necesidad de infiltrar en la frontera un elemento numeroso de gentes de buen consejo y cautela, y abrir sobre la masa de este país una campaña infatigable de lo que pudiera llamarse explicación de México. The Lomas reference cited the word masa, masses, people, as mesa, table, with the resulting translation, I quote, the need to infiltrate in the borderlands a numerous element of wise and cautious people, and to open upon the coffee table of this country a tireless campaign that we might call an explanation of Mexico. What is Martí saying? He suggests infusing the border area with a goodly number of people of sound counsel and prudence, and spreading before the masses of the country, that's the United States, an untiring campaign of what could be called an explanation about Mexico. Lomas is not alone in rendering Martí's writing askew. Esther Allen, in her chapter In Sinking the Americas, He Has Not Made Himself Known to Me, José Martí, U.S. History and the Question of Translation, cites an example from the book edited by U.S. historian Philip Foner, Inside the Monster, Writings on the United States and American Imperialism by José Martí, a book which uses translations by Eleanor Randall. In an 1885 chronicle about a conference held at Lake Mohonk in upstate New York to discuss Indian policies, Martí began with a line that conveyed respect for nature. I quote, "Convidan a la grandeza los bosques de Adirondack cercanos que talan sin sistema especuladores torpes." The Cuban author contrasted the grandeur of the Adirondack forests near the conference site with reckless tree felling by speculators. But Randall's translation, as quoted by Esther Allen, read, and I quote, "The forests of the adjacent Adirondacks beckon to grandeur, unsystematically cutting down crude speculators." Well, how could it read? The nearby Adirondack forests inspire grandeur, but are being cut down recklessly by inept speculators. Randall, who translated several volumes of Martí articles, was no doubt pressured by time. Alas, the result is translation mistakes of many flavors, far, far too many to list. For this talk, I will focus on Nuestra América, an essay with wide distribution that many read in English translation. Randall's translation of Nuestra América first appeared in Our America, Writings on Latin America and the Struggle for Cuban Independence, published in 1977 as part of a series of 4 books by Monthly Review Press. Then it appeared in a reprint with a new cover, and subsequently in the José Martí Reader, Writings on the Americas, published by Ocean Press, 1999. This slide gives one definitive example of why Randall's version is not a good choice, even though it has been extensively adopted. In paragraph 3, where Martí decries those in the Americas who turn to Europe rather than their native lands, he asks a rhetorical question about George Washington. Did Washington, who made that land for them, go and live with the English during the years when he saw the English marching against his own land? Of course not. That's the point of a rhetorical question. But Randall gave the opposite meaning. The Washington, who made this land for them, did he not go to live with the English, at a time when he saw them fighting against his own country? Now, let's look at more Nuestra América with comparative translations. Here, one can see successful translations by Esther Allen alongside versions that missed the mark. In the first example, the word onto is not appropriate. The Republic of Mexico was not lifted onto Indian shoulders, but rather a republic in Mexico, Allen's wording, built upon Indian contributions. In the second example, the 2 independence leaders were not dressed like monarchs or kings, but rather were still burdened by the monarchic traditions of colonial Spanish America. And about the leader who turned back. In Spanish, volvió riendas, Martí's wording, means turned back rather than giving the reins to someone else. Conclusions. Conclusions bring us back to the good. For Nuestra America, read Esther Allen. For a comprehensive introduction to Martí, Esther Allen. Prose translations by Dionys and Baralt are also good. But if you come across a version of Martí in English that seems quite odd or awkward, it very likely is not faithful or fair to Martí and may fall in the category of problematic, either bad or very unusual. Examples given here are designed to suggest some criteria for assessing translations, but should not discourage the reading public from discovering Martí's often complex but fascinating works in English translation. Top-notch versions are available. Thank you.